the news media really let us down through COVID. Now, maybe they were scared. Maybe they thought they were doing what's best for Canadians. There's this idea of a noble lie. Do you willfully lie if your aims are good? And, my take is, if you're a journalist, the answer to that, needs to be no. It's been a while since I've talked about the CBC, one of my favorite Canadian news outlets. Not so much to read and take too seriously, but more just to see what's going on, or at least what a certain subgroup of Canadian culture thinks is going on. And it's also important because we do pay for it. It's our public broadcaster. There's been a couple articles or pieces that I've seen in these last couple weeks that I think are worth mentioning. One of them was actually very good, I thought, or actually a couple of them were decent. One had to do with journalism, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But first, there's this one here about the Greenbelt and Doug Ford. And there's been a number of articles about, the Auditor General's report finding, or again, I haven't really read up on this story, so forgive me if I don't have all the details right. But from what I've understood, the Auditor General is saying that there seems to be some kind of foul play or potential corruption as regards to land being allocated to developers. And frankly, I think the CBC had a reasonable article here, the Greenbelt and Doug Ford, what's next? And it talks about there being calls for resignations and things like that. And as I understand it, it seems that what's being alleged is, I guess there's a Greenbelt law sort of around the city of Toronto that is meant to prevent development in this Greenbelt area. And through some sort of political and bureaucratic mechanism, I guess there's ways to get exceptions made so that certain development can happen in the Greenbelt. And it seems that perhaps some housing developers either lobbied or persuaded the Doug Ford government to make some changes that would be favorable to those development companies. Again, I'm not sure what's proven or not, but I think it's worth a look. And I applaud the CBC for looking into something like this, and our Auditor General. I think, this was something that stood out to me because, frankly, I think we should have journalists in Canada that look into these things. I mean, it's not that hard to imagine. I mean, you don't have to be an evil developer necessarily, but developers, their whole business is to develop. And I can see, again, I'm not sure if they did anything illegal or not. I don't know the details, but it stands to reason that whether overtly or subtly, that the developers are going to be pressuring political leaders to make policy changes that are favorable to their business. I mean, it makes sense. And I think we see this, I've seen this, when we think about corruption, we often think of some large scandal, and there are certainly those that happen, but what I've seen firsthand is often more subtle. And again, there's gray areas. I think, for example, early in my career, I worked in human resources for a particular manufacturing company, and we were hiring temporary workers basically through an agency. And there was one agency, and actually as an HR person, I kind of like them. And it just turned out that over time, I guess our head office kind of made them the preferred supplier, which is fine. I thought they provided a reasonable service. And, over time, again, I'm not saying any of this was necessarily offside, but just for example, this particular company, sponsored a sort of a Christmas party. So all the different HR people from the various branches would be taken out by the supplier, have a couple drinks, have a nice meal, and it was to sort of say thank you. And again, I'm not saying that's offside, but that's just one example where clearly this temporary employment agency was trying to curry favor, and some of this is normative. But the point is, these things do make a difference. So we have to guard against that type of thing to make sure that if we're in a position of authority, and I think to varying degrees we all are, to not be swayed, or at least put up certain barriers to make sure that things don't go beyond what might be normal and customary. And again, I think a Christmas party is not unreasonable, but it does raise the question. So CBC, good for them. we need an independent news media to look for corruption when there's powerful forces like developers that have a lot of money, a lot of capital that's at stake. They're going to, whether consciously, subconsciously, directly or indirectly, try to curry favor with politicians. In a similar vein, there's this other note, or I'm not sure what to even call it. It's a news editor's blog, and this is by Brodie Fenlon, and this was a couple weeks ago or so, maybe not even, just about a week ago. And so I guess it's sort of an opinion piece, and he's talking as, I guess he's the news editor, or the editor-in-chief, I suppose. And he talks about sort of what I've just been talking about, the importance of having an independent news media that's willing to do some digging, that's willing to bring things to light. And he talks about how it's difficult to get access of information. I thought this is, again, he makes some good points here. And again, I'm not sure what the whole angle here is, but if the CBC and other news media were to actually do what he's talking about, I know he's just one person, he's not the whole organization, but this is exactly what we need our news media to do. Now, I can't help but notice that, recently we had this pandemic, and just like it's reasonable to assume that these developers in Ontario might be, inappropriately persuading the Ontario government to make policy decisions that favor them and their profits, why is it so inconceivable to think that on some level, perhaps, big pharmaceutical companies exerted power in the news media, at different political agencies, especially like public health units and things like that, the whole medical system. Now, again, that's not to say everyone's absolutely corrupt from top to bottom, but it's worth looking into. It's something that we need an independent news media to do. And I've talked about this before, and I'm certainly not the first person to bring it up, obviously, but the news media really let us down through COVID. Now, maybe they were scared. Maybe they thought they were doing what's best for Canadians. There's this idea of a noble lie. Do you willfully lie if your aims are good? And, my take is, if you're a journalist, the answer to that, needs to be no. Again, maybe there's some really, really, really extreme threshold for that. But even that, I want to say fairly absolutely, or as close to absolutely as I can muster, to say, no, you don't do that. And why don't you do that? Well, I guess you could say if you tell a noble lie, you might be able to do some net good in the moment, perhaps, if you're somewhat clairvoyant and if you have the best information compared to the populace. And I think maybe some media types thought that's what was happening during COVID, where they had to amp things up to get people scared so that the scared people would act in their own best interests. That comes at a huge cost. I mean, there's the whole civil liberties things, but even just from CBC's point of view, and I use CBC sort of as a stand-in, but you could just as easily say Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Global News, CTV, etc. That's sort of the mainstream news media in this country. But the big cost for them is their reputation. Clearly they weren't being forthright. Clearly they weren't being journalists. They were being activists. We see this a lot. Now, if what Brodie is talking about, if they can get to go back the other way and actually do journalism, I would be all for it. I would even be in favor of spending public money for that type of institution. The trouble is, journalists increasingly have stopped doing journalism and have instead taken up advocacy. They become political advocates more than anything else. And there's another article, and I won't, lots of people have spoken about it, but this article that I guess was through the Canadian press, where they were talking about, Pierre Poilievre is, speaking the language of conspiracy theorists. And that's pretty rich. Again, I saw it on CBC, but it's a Canadian press wire service thing. It's interesting. I was looking at some of the CBC articles from a while ago. So this one here, this is under the tab Science, so we can know it's true because you can trust the science. And the title reads, No, the new coronavirus wasn't created in a lab, scientists say. This is a very standard trope for CBC, the here's our opinion, comma, experts say, scientists say, authorities say. And so this was, when was this? This was March 24th, 2020. So obviously very early on in the pandemic. But they've already decided, I guess the news media at CBC's looked at this, and they're quite sure that this is disinformation. One of the most persistent and widespread pieces of disinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic has been the conspiracy theory that the novel coronavirus that causes the disease was created in a lab and was let loose either by accident or on purpose by some nefarious actor. The theory not only lives on social media and the internet, message boards pushing conspiracy theories, but has been publicly floated by politicians. So the CBC is telling us we should not, we should not even talk about these conspiracy theories. The whole idea of a conspiracy theory is obviously meant to malign someone who holds that view. Now, of course, if you look at more recent CBC articles, there's one where, they have to admit that, the lab leak theory is now becoming more mainstream. Yet they were the ones that were saying that this is a conspiracy theory. So that's just one conspiracy theory that turned out to be, whether or not true, it seems that there's a lot of evidence that, it came from this lab. I don't think that's controversial to say at this moment, but at least it's being discussed, whereas before, just even mentioning it was heresy as far as the mainstream media is concerned. So for Brodie Fenlon, I applaud his idea here. If he and others at the CBC and the mainstream media can get back to actually doing journalism, I think that would be great. But this whole coronavirus thing, the pandemic, is still kind of hanging over their heads. And I know there's a lot of people that just want to move on, and I want to move on too. But before I think Canadians can begin to even consider trusting their news media, we need to get people like the CBC to stand at a lectern and tell us, admit that they got it wrong, tell us what they're doing now to prevent them getting it wrong in the future. I don't expect them to be perfect, but clearly they were not acting in good faith when they declared things to be true that no one could possibly know was true. I mean, the classic, of course, is safe and effective. It's not that I thought the vaccines was necessarily not safe or effective. I just knew that the people saying that at the time could not have known that. Yet they said it forthrightly and, very adamantly, with no room for any dissent whatsoever. So, Brodie Fenlon, if you want to return to doing journalism, I would welcome that. But you and your organization and other people in the mainstream media need to, come clean and admit how you guys got this COVID-19 pandemic so wrong on so many levels, and show us what you're doing internally, what checks and balances you're putting in place to make sure that you don't get bamboozled like that in the future. Journalism is important in a free and democratic society. Speech is important. Being able to debate openly with one another, these are fundamental values to our society. And if we lose those, I fear that we're going to lose lots of other good and valuable things that come with our society. Tell me what you think. Is the CBC on the right track here? Am I foolish for even thinking that there might be some people in the CBC that might even be seeing this? Or is the whole mainstream media just good for nothing and it's time that we shut it down? Tell me what you think. Am I on the right track? Am I out to lunch? Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.